Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for sticking around. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Jasmine Drake, Associate Professor at Texas Southern University, Governor-appointed Forensic Science Commissioner in Texas, and TSU Center for Justice Research Fellow, presenting on the intersectionality of forensic science and criminal justice reform. Dr. Drake.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen here. So thanks for having me today. Today, I'm going to talk about the criminal justice system as a whole and the intersectionality of forensic science with the criminal justice system. And a lot of times when we think about all of these major criminal justice reform measures and issues and legislation that are going forward, a lot of times what's missing from that conversation is the forensic science side. So hopefully, at the end of this presentation, everyone will have a little better understanding of how forensic science actually plays a key role and should in criminal justice reform. So just a little bit about me. So my background is a little all over the place. So I figured that I was like a person who never knew exactly what I wanted to do. So I started off in the hard sciences. So my bachelor's degree is in chemistry. I have a PhD in chemistry from Louisiana State University. I did a postdoc and worked at a nuclear reactor. So that's more physics. So I did chemistry, physics. After that, I went and worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And I got experience as a forensic chemist. And there, as a forensic chemist, our job was to analyze evidence that was submitted by local, federal, and state law enforcement agencies and look for the presence or the absence of drugs in those evidentiary samples. And so I got some really good experience in forensic science and actually the court system as a whole, and working from the scientists or expert side of forensic science. I later went into academia, where I've been since. I taught at Sam Houston State University for a forensic science department, and now I'm at Texas Southern University, and I'm an associate professor. We have a forensic science learning lab there, and I'm also, as Jude said before, a Center for Justice Research Fellow. So I'll tell you how all of this work kind of merges together, as well as a commissioner for the Texas Forensic Science Commission. We actually had a meeting this morning. And so this just shows some of the pictures of some of the different types of science that I've been able to do, but all of this has merged together. So I used to think more like a hard scientist, where we say you're thinking about lab experiments, but now I've started to think more about the criminal justice policies and implications in the world of criminal justice. So it's been an interesting career shift. One of the things that I've learned as an educator is that in order for us to look at true criminal justice reform and measures, we need some diversity. And so in some of the sciences and some of the areas where you have experts in forensic science in particular, there's a lack of diversity or a lack of people from different various backgrounds. So I'm at a historically Black college and university in the heart of Houston, Texas. We have a minor in forensic science program. And so mostly what we do is we target our training and resources to educating our students about criminal justice fields and criminal justice reform measures, and how to actually understand or get a good understanding of forensic science and how it all works together. So I teach a lot of students that are criminal justice majors. We also offer forensic science hands-on laboratory training opportunities. And this piece is really important to get everybody speaking the same language. So when I talk to different people, one thing I learned once I started doing more criminal justice reform work is that I realized that everybody had a common goal. We want justice, we want to see justice served, but a lot of times we speak different languages. And so the hard scientists or your chemists or your biologists who are running the actual samples may speak a different language from your law enforcement officers. And then there's a different language with your judicial branch or your judges and your attorneys. And then you have the community stakeholders and, the civilians who are interested in getting answers. And so a lot of times training is going to be key. And I'll talk a little bit more about that training. That's going to be very important in, getting everyone on the same page. And so we do offer training opportunities for all of those groups in the labs, and we do hands-on training as well. So when we talk about how does forensic science actually merge with the criminal justice reform efforts that we're seeing today, there are some key areas that I wanted to point out. You have the judicial and legal training, advocacy opportunities. And so what we do in our lab is I do a lot of work, and I'm surprised that this work really took off, that I ended up doing a lot of work of training science, training judges and attorneys, science, hard science. So we've had different groups come into the lab, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important, that the judges and the attorneys understand the fundamental science and the inner workings of the criminal justice system. I've also, some of my work, we've looked at examining some of those drug policies. Some of the drug policies that we currently see are outdated. Some of them show, are not equitable amongst different groups, amongst different racial groups or socioeconomic groups. And so it's important to look at those drug policies and look at the populations that they impact, and to reevaluate if they need to be revamped or if they should stay the way they are. So that's another thing that I've kind of looked at with my work. Also, some of the work that I do on the Texas Forensic Science Commission, all of our work is guided towards recommending best practices in the field of forensic science. So are some of the techniques that people are doing to make calls in some of these big cases, we'll talk about some of those big cases, are those practices outdated? Are those not really what we should be doing as we move forward in forensics? And also looking at some of the crime scenes. So we'll talk a little bit about looking at crime scenes, because all of that is forensics. That's where it starts, at the crime scene. So we have the PCAS report, and this was a Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And what they found in, I think, 2016, it was a scathing report that said that forensics was getting it wrong. And in some key areas, forensics became under scrutiny because we had certain areas that were actually had some subjectivity to them, or comparison methods, where the analyst is looking at one thing and they're comparing it to something else. And in some of these areas, we found that different experts were on the stand, and they were really overstating their confidence in a technique. They were overstating the relevance of the evidence that they analyzed, and this was having dire, consequences in the criminal justice system. And so you could just imagine an expert sitting on a stand, and they're telling, some jurors that we're 100% sure that it could be nobody else. This is a match. And so we even stray away from using that kind of language now. We don't really say match. We'll say something is consistent. So these are some of the problems that we saw. And so what this report said is that in forensics, we needed to start to look at these expert testimonies and actually scrutinizing these testimonies and making sure that people were doing the correct work and that they were not overstating their confidence on the stand. And so this kind of put forensic science under the magnifying glass. After this report, there were some different types of attempts to strengthen the forensic science, just in general, the practices, and to increase, best practices being used in recommendations, because it was almost like in forensics, people were going rogue and just kind of doing what they wanted to do. So one thing was the formation in Texas. Our call to service here was to create the Texas Forensic Science Commission. And so what we do is this offers, and this is just one of several that are in different states around the country. And so it offers a place for licensing of analysts, for complaints and laboratory disclosures, for us to actually do investigations if we think that some forensics work is not being done correctly. Also for discipline-specific reviews. So there have been some disciplines where people have not been doing the right thing. And so we're able to review those and see and offer our best practices and write up what people should be doing in those areas. So why the judicial and legal training? And so what we find is in a lot of these places, I was just talking to somebody about this earlier, you'll have someone who has a defense attorney or public defender. They don't have a lot of money for training and going to these fancy science training camps and things like that. And so they have to be the advocate for that person who may not have a good deal of money or can't afford another attorney. And so what we've done to try to create equity in the system is to offer low cost or no cost judicial and legal training, especially geared towards defense attorneys and public defenders, where they can learn what they need to look for. They can learn how to be an effective advocate for their client. And I think justice starts, there with your attorney actually having some type of scientific knowledge, because how can you really give scrutiny to something that you don't understand? So I included a case specific example. So this was a case that went to the California Supreme Court, and I always use this as an example. So this was a case where the guy wanted to use a diminished capacity defense and saying he killed up police officers in 1980. And so what they brought forward was they said they did not find any types of drugs in his system using one particular instrument. But because he must have had an attorney who realized that there was another test that could be run, he was able to request for them to run a secondary test, and they found that drug in his system. And so the California Supreme Court actually overturned the jury's death sentence because of something as simple as that, just being able to show that there was exculpatory evidence that wasn't brought to the table. So I won't go through all of this, but I just want to show some of the things in the trainings that we point out to attorneys that we want them to pay attention to. We want them to look at the testimony that's being given. We want them to be able to challenge like what types of procedures are being done, making sure they know if something is based on science. We had a lot of people who were on the stand that were making testimonies based on their opinion, so we need to make sure that we're keeping those people honest who are on the stand. They need to make sure that testing is sufficient. And so some things we tell attorneys is to make sure that you can get a secondary test. You don't have to go with what the lab gives you. You can also ask or request to do a secondary test there. So we show them things to look at, and I'm just showing you some of the things that we show them in these trainings. We go over things as like what's in the lab report, and actually them requesting the entire lab report, and them being able to look at the data and see what's there, them being able to ask questions about the laboratory standard operating procedures, quality assurance techniques, all types of calculations. And so they actually learn that. And what's cool is we've had attorneys come in and we put them in the laboratory coats and the gloves, and they actually run samples, and they get a lot of questions from that, and they get a lot of understanding of where things could go wrong when you work in the lab. We also show them lab reports, point out what things are actually provided in drug lab reports or toxicology lab reports, which is really important. We give them areas to ask about, such as the methodology that's used. Where was it developed? Is it vetted? Is it accepted in the scientific community? All of these things that are what people would think would be something that's lab specific, these could have dire consequences in the criminal justice outcomes that we see. So I've been working as a research fellow at the Center for Justice Research. So this is kind of where my scientific background merged with me being interested in criminal justice, reform measures, and drug policy. So a lot of my work here is working on drug policies. And at the center, we look at different policies and actually looking at things that are not equitable, and based on race or socioeconomics, and that are barriers to success in certain communities or disenfranchised communities. One project that I worked on was looking at the war on drugs. So a lot of these drug policies like the opioid epidemic, things have changed. When the user has changed, we've seen that we've went from more of a criminal or war on drugs type of approach to a rehabilitative approach. And so we see that this war on drugs, what was typically the war on drugs, now everyone is calling it a public health crisis, but this changed based on the face of the user. And so we do see that things are changing here. So the current phase of the opioid epidemic has been, it has affected primarily rural and suburban white non-Hispanics, However, when we were in the 70s, we had a heroin epidemic. And so that was still a heroin is an opioid. So it's just, how do we look at these based on the user? And so just looking at the trends, and I won't go through all of this, but we've seen increases in the number of opioid overdose deaths amongst the Hispanic communities as well as the Blacks communities as well. And so this just shows some of the data, the race and ethnicity data. Although we see the largest numbers amongst white non-Hispanics, we're still seeing this increase in the Black and Hispanic communities. And so this just shows some of the states where you might not expect, where you do have those deaths in states that are for Blacks and Hispanics that are over the national average. And this is becoming even more of an issue now that we have the COVID pandemic. So I'm starting to look at some of those numbers, and in states, I think in like 43 states, the number of overdose deaths are up, which is, those numbers are staggering. So that's something that we'll have to look at once this pandemic is over. And I'm just showing here that the number of deaths, it used to be, in certain communities where cocaine would be the majority of the deaths, but you're seeing that the opioids are really increasing in those Black and Hispanic communities over the past 18 years. So I just showed, this is some more of that data. I think I'm going to run short on time, so I'm just going to scroll through, but I did want to show some of these pieces. I have a reference to the paper if you want to go back and look at some of this data and some of the things that are contributing to these problems. So there's a lack of evidence-based solutions and policies for addressing opioid abuse in these minority communities, and also done studies on marijuana drug policies and looking at how it affects different groups as well in the policies. But what we're seeing is more of a shift towards it being treated as a public health crisis as opposed to a war on drugs. But we see some different factors that actually contribute to that. There's underprescribing of prescription drugs to minorities in those communities. And sometimes there's a lack of evidence-based treatment solutions that work and that are culturally relevant in those areas. And because of the underprescribing, many minorities or people in low socioeconomic or disadvantaged communities are reaching out to get illicit preparations. And so those preparations, we're seeing these new bad guys, the synthetic opioids. And so we're having an issue with that. So that's increasing the spikes of overdoses we see. And so we see that the numbers for the population, we Blacks make up over 12% of the US population, but 33% of the incarcerated population. So this all ties into mass incarceration and some of the need for criminal justice reform. Also, in the Hispanic communities, we're seeing similar numbers. There's 17% of the population making up 50% of the federal drug cases. So we're seeing some inequality here. And so what we need to do moving forward with these drug policies is to look at these drug policies, create culturally sensitive solutions for the opioids problem in these communities, and also get some better treatment systems and faith-based treatment systems and systems that work in these particular communities. I just wanted to end by showing some of the cases that have been in the news media, because when we talk about crime scene cases and things of that nature, I wanted to point out that forensics does play a huge role in these. And so I know everybody's probably been watching the George Floyd case, and everyone has seen the video of what happened with the officers. And at this case, you see that you have forensic experts who are on the stand, and they are saying, okay, he had drugs in his system. But what I wanted to point out was, even with some of these cases, it's not just, cut and dry. What would happen if we didn't have a video where we saw exactly what happened? Yes, he had drugs in his system, but were those drugs enough to cause an overdose? And so with a lot of these cases, that we have to look at the forensics really carefully, and those have dire, consequences as far as our outcomes in these cases. So what's considered an accidental overdose versus what's considered in the Sandra Bland case a suicide, and all of this has to go hand in hand with the actual forensics. This is another one, the Alton Sterling. Even though we saw a video where he was an officer involved shooting, and we know that his death was caused by being shot, he also has substances in his system. And so this is a very complex problem, and we actually have to look to the forensics when we're looking at these different issues. And so that's all I have for you today. I know I probably threw a lot at you, but feel free to ask me some questions.
That's outstanding, Dr. Drake. Thank you so much. This is the second time I've had the privilege of hearing you speak, and I learn something new every single time. So we do have a couple of questions. So you actually sort of mentioned the Derek Chauvin murder trial, and someone commented that it's just clear how different forensic scientists and other types of expert witnesses can sort of come to wildly different conclusions about aspects of a crime scene, and even things as serious as cause of death. So I'm just interested to know what is your take on what you're seeing there? I mean, it seems from the outsider, like an untrained eye, that this is just basically raw, naked bias. But I'm interested to know, as a forensic scientist, what's your take on what we see in that very public trial?
Yeah, what's interesting to me, and I think that's a really good question. I've talked to other forensic analysts, and I'll turn on the trial and watch some of the experts on the stand. And it's just amazing how you can see someone have a totally different perception. And that shows some of the bias that you have. And of course, for the defense, you have those experts who you can find an expert that will support your particular case. But we all saw, all I always think about is, what if we didn't have that video? What if there was not that video, and we have someone who we say had fentanyl in their system? Because we're like, fentanyl, people overdose on that. So if we had not seen that video and actually had evidence, like something that the world could see, a lot of this would hold up. It would seem pretty valid. Now, the experts, their jobs for the defense experts that they're hiring, is kind of wild for me to see that they are trying to say that maybe he had COVID before, maybe it's some respiratory issues based on the drugs, and all of those things would be considerations if we hadn't seen the action that happened. Well, we see that there were respiration issues because we saw someone's knee on somebody's neck. So I mean, but it just makes you wonder. You see how in these cases, what if there was no video? What would the science point to?
Yeah, it sounds like it's almost like whose science, you know what I mean? Like it's like the science you choose, and so it seems like there's been some strides made, but there needs to be more. I think we could take one more question. Let's see, let me see. Does the federal administration in power greatly sway the amount of funding and attention to this topic, or is it generally seen as bipartisan?
Well, usually, like in the state of Texas, a lot of the work that I do on the Forensic Science Commission is going to be bipartisan. So really, we just want to see good science. And I mean, we just want to see justice served, so the state actually supports our investigations and our meetings, but I do have to say that every state doesn't have a commission like the one that we have in Texas. We're very progressive. We're hoping that there are more commissions. There used to be a national like forensic science commission, and with different budgetary cuts and things, those have kind of been broken up, and but they do have some systems that do federal standards in forensic science. But yeah, it could be a toss up depending on what state you're in.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much. I am going to try to pull off what my colleagues have done so well here. So we're going to go ahead and move you folks over. Anyone who wants to continue the conversation with Dr. Drake, you can go to bit.ly/D4. Oh, Haley to the rescue. Thank you, Haley. D4J breakout. Also remember, you can enter the second Q-Side raffle for fabulous Q-Side merchandise.